Hello everyone, this is your professor Wang Dewei. This lecture is about chapter 6 from Spurrier's and Topi's book. It's about project planning and product backlog creation. This chapter is basically an extension of the discussion of comparing the Agile methodology with the traditional plan-driven based project management or hybrid methodology. From the textbook frameworks perspective, we are moving from a more project higher level planning and the method selection to actually conduct a project management task in the IT project field. The assumption is now that we have already conducted some user story requirement gathering, and from there we need to plan, schedule, get people together, and start working on the project. And because it's closely related to the project management concept you might have learned in other classes or from previous production and operation management related course. And one of the basic time and resource management tool, especially time management, deadline management, as we have discussed already, is this Gantt chart, or an alternative tool will be CPM or PERT chart. Gantt chart is most commonly used because it's convenient, simple, easy to read, and almost everybody can generate one of this chart with a very simple tool. The assumption of the Gantt chart is that we have a prior knowledge of exactly what needs to be done, and we can divide the task into multiple segments. Some of the things have to be done prior to the other task has need to be started, and you put all these tasks together into a map or a timeline, and it becomes a Gantt chart. It is a perfect tool, assuming that your project has a very good structure, meaning that all the tasks need to be completed is pretty much known already, and there is no ambiguity about how much time or what kind of job has more difficulty for you to perform. A typical project like this will be something like say you want to build a automobile manually, and building an automobile is not rocket science anymore, and everything that required to make an automobile run is already there. Their engine, their transmission system, their suspension, everything seems to be there. And after the designer come up with the blueprint, if the parts are ready, you can actually come up with an assembly plan to construct the automobile. However, on the other hand, the software project that we are dealing with is slightly different. Software is a lot of time a moving target. So when you are dealing with the moving target, the user requirement keep changing. This type of project is not so easy to be mapped into a Gantt chart. But of course, a Gantt chart can be modified to accommodate some uncertainty. Say, for example, if you ask a programmer to write a piece of code, and that piece of code happens to be very difficult to write, and you may provide some sort of an estimate or some flexibility. Instead of say, we're going to be writing that module in 1 or 2 days, you give the programmer somewhere between 1 to 5 days, and you can counting or actually map that kind of flexibility in a modified Gantt chart as well. Nonetheless, if the uncertainty is too high, and this type of chart will be totally unreliable. As a matter of fact, this type of modified Gantt chart is also seen in the concept of PERT, the CPM versus PERT. Without further explaining those project management concept, basically the PERT method is using some sort of probability model, try to give you some estimate of how early or how late a particular job will be completed or delayed. Similarly, you can count those probability concept into Gantt chart as well. Even though the the estimate of this type of Gantt chart is not as accurate as the PERT method. It is a feasible method, and there is a new terminology actually your textbook introduced. It's called a Gantt light chart, and this light version of the Gantt chart actually include some sort of a human judgment. So you are using the human estimate or experience, try to guess the range or the time that a particular task need to be performed. And you may also identify the bottleneck or the critical point. You can probably notice there is a red dot on this particular Gantt chart. It signifies the importance of that particular task, tends to be delayed or is very important for person to complete. And the other improvement of this Gantt chart compared to the traditional Gantt chart is that it also includes additional dimension. And this additional dimension is called a responsibility assignment. In the way that it links the project management in terms of the human resource management to the time management. And Gantt chart itself is, of course, is a scheduling tool, so it is a time management tool. When you modify this particular Gantt chart by assigning a person or resources that is associated with that particular job, then you achieve the goals of managing the resources and the time together. And on this particular chart, you can also perceive that the job or the task that can be laid out in phases in this particular case, and the different user story or user requirement is also a requirement management tool. So you are managing requirements, you are managing resource or people, and you're also managing time all together in a visually appealing chart in this particular case. This type of method is highly recommended as a business student in the future, regardless if you're doing a job like a software development job or a typical organization process improvement job. You should always use this type of chart to visually control and visually explain the project progress and managing the time and people accordingly. If you are managing a team, this will be a perfect communication tool for people to see and work with you. And this type of tool is particularly important because it is readily available in a typical office product, such as in this case Microsoft Excel. So when you're creating Microsoft Excel, there are already a lot of these predefined template that you can use. In the case we're doing project management, you can always go into, say, in this category called planner and tracker. You can find various versions of Gantt chart. Here is one, that's a traditional one, and here's another one. I believe somewhere, say, a data tracker Gantt chart, different version, tracking different aspects of the Gantt chart. And using this type of tool, and I recommend this Gantt chart compared to a traditional calendar because Gantt chart has that additional dimension you can track, regardless it's a resource, human being, or a requirement. So using Gantt chart, and one of the important lessons I would like you to remember when you are taking away from this particular class. Coming back to the Gantt chart we see is called Gantt chart light or Gantt light chart, and you see that the ambiguity is also represented by the overlapping of the precedence relationship between one job to the other. So they will be overlapping from one phase to the other. When I say overlapping, is relating to something like this one. This is the overlapping area that you're looking at. The starting point can be ambiguous in a way between each two jobs. Now, another important aspect of reading this Gantt chart is that if you look at the first column of the Gantt chart, you see a set of job description in terms of the phases, in terms of the some sort of requirement, and your textbook use the term user story to describe this. And typically, we in different organizations in the UML world, we call them use case. And this use case or user story will be playing into a typical agile or hybrid type of methodology. And the textbook rely a lot on this agile methodology called, or actually not agile, it's more like a hybrid methodology called the Scrum. And using the Scrum terminology, they use the phases and the sprint to managing the project. So regardless of the Gantt chart or the methodology you use, and you have to, again, coming from previous chapter, decided on how you're going to be using the management approach. It's, again, three different type: plain-driven, hybrid, or agile methodology. At a more detailed level of implementation in terms of project management in this particular chapter, there are some big differences between plain-driven and agile approach. Let me emphasize on the biggest difference that you should be able to find on this slide. That will be something what we call the product backlog. And the product backlog is essentially the spirit of agile methodology. Let me use two analogies to explain the thing called the product backlog. First of all, at the personal project management level, imagine yourself, actually I do this a lot. There is actually a few management trade book or popular best-selling books talking about this, called How Do You Manage Your Personal Time, doing time management, that sort of thing. One of the important skill in personal time management is to create something what we call the to-do list. And you will find this to-do list on your Microsoft Outlook or on the Microsoft share service that you see, any or actually Google Calendar. You can always create this to-do list. And to-do list is actually essentially the product backlog at the personal level. The other example that I use as an analogy for the product backlog is the so-called the just-in-time management in the production and operation management field. Now, if you recall some of the terminology you learned there, and there is a Japanese word called a Kanban system. And what is a Kanban system? It basically says I have monitoring sort of a queue management tools and physically to manage the inventory or the parts to be used in our assembly or production process. So the queue is a set of job to be performed, and once the queue drop to a certain level, and you have to replenish the queue. And this product backlog is the queue of the job that or requirements, sometimes we call them, to be performed in a project management field. So the basic concept is that you need to create this queue and somehow manage this queue so you can always feed a certain job to your project team. It could be a programmer, could be the business analyst, could be the some sort of a meeting coordination or some kind of survey study. Any one of this job need to be queued into a product backlog, and this product backlog, if managed well, then you can create a very good schedule, such as a Gantt light schedule, and you can manage your product time accordingly. So the question now is, how do you create this product backlog? Now, both hybrid approach and the agile approach use this product backlog. The major difference is that the agile approach allows the product backlog to change all the time, but the hybrid approach will always come up with some priority based on a predefined, the big upfront requirement or big upfront design. So this BRUF and BDUF and BRUF, these two type of concept will dominate the size and the priority of your product backlog. So one is a free backlog, always changing, both fluid. The other one is semi-fluid. You always be guided by this requirement or design that you already specify earlier in the product stage. Now, the next thing to discuss here is how do we come up with this backlog, and what does that mean by a single unit of the job to be performed in a product backlog? And this is really a very difficult question to answer, but it can also be very simple. It is difficult because there is no 100% precise rule to define what exactly is a job in the backlog. But there are some guiding principles or guidelines that you can follow to define that a piece of work can be considered one unit to be delivered in a particular time period. Now, one of the very commonly used one is called the user story that we learned from previous chapter, or use case if you have some UML training. So each use case or each user story will be sort of identified as the right size of the program that you write in a day or in a week. And I keep saying that a day or a week because that's the human cycle of completing a job. So typically we try to divide or try to modularize your software project into smaller tasks, and each one of this programming or building or website building or purchasing project can be complete in a day, a week, or no more than a month usually. And this topic also related to another important concept we study in process design called the scale and transaction. And these two concepts we will probably be discussed in several different places. Here I like to simply saying that when we are usually drawing a flowchart or a process flowchart in a layman sense, I mean before you receive a software design and modularizing training, a typical user will try to map everything he or she can think of from the beginning all the way to the end for a particular experience cycle, some sort of business experience cycle, instead of thinking in terms of software cycle or software job. So it's very likely you will come up with a very long flowchart to describe, say, your experience of going to, say, for example, a retail business. You go into the retail business, you can now describe the experience of you going to Walmart, and you are greeted by a person, and you pick up product, put them into shopping cart, and you put some product back into the shelf, and the associate in Walmart will put some of the thing you kind of mismanaged into their original shelf, and then you go to the checkout, select different checkout line, and then you go out of the door, and so on and so forth. This can be a very lengthy and long process involving many people and many jobs. But it is not the software or computer cycle that we are dealing with, because a lot of these jobs are not performed by either computer or will be performed by multiple computer programs in the process. So as a good business analyst, you have to identify those piecemeal jobs that need to be translated into a small piece of program to be written and then can be tested before you release to the real software and operational environment. So one of the typical skill is that to read a long process. In this case, your text will show you a long activity diagram similar to a flow chart, and you identify something called the user story. And the user story, again, will be the single unit that you assign as a job or requirement. And typically it involves, again, a programmer 1 day's work or 1 week's work. You assign this piece of program to the programmer. He or she can complete that in a week. For example, you will not, say, assign a program to write a point of sale system in a week or in a day, but you may ask your programmer to write a function that calculates the total when the user scan the product and you read the barcode and calculate the total and generate a receipt. And that little job of reading the product information, look up the product price, and generate the total, charge the customer, and print out the receipt, that is doable for a programmer in a day or in a week. So that will be considered a very good user story to be identified in the requirement stage. So one of the recommendations usually that we try to, in my class, I usually recommend when you are drawing a flow chart, activity diagram, or a use case model, which I believe you already have experience from our assignment, is to make sure that you use a very simple verb phrase and no subject. The subject is already identified by the swim lane. So use a verb, use an object to describe the job to be done. When you can use a single verb to describe that particular job, it's usually a very good candidate for a user story, and that user story can be written in a program in a relatively short time, and that's very good. And when you put a lot of user story together, you can come up with a use case diagram, and that summarize the theme or the module that need to be done in the use case diagram. And also another important point, which we will probably discuss when we have more discussion on the use case model, that is each use case or user story should be independent of each other. They are not related. In the activity diagram, like what we are seeing here, one job usually related to another in a precedence relationship. But actually, when we are drawing use case model, we try to make sure each one of these little program is independent of each other. They can be executed without the dependency on the other one. So the recommendation in use case model is do not put too many dependency among the use cases. Why this recommendation is proposed? This is related to the nature of software program. You want your software program to be highly modularized, and if your program is not highly modularized, and the problem is when one part of your program breaks down, the entire program will be not functioning. But when your program is highly modularized, when one part breaks down, the rest of the smaller piece of program can still functionally. So simply saying that is actually links to the nature of computer program, and it links to the reliability of your computer program as well. So once you be able to identify all these user story or the use cases, you can put those use cases and the user story into a requirement and time management planning. And usually the typical process is you have to first of all create a product backlog, and then you can schedule something in the Scrum methodology, one of the Agile methodology, use the sprint and use phases and try to map out the entire project in a reasonable time frame. In the reasonable time frame, again, we have a pretty good consensus already in the software environment. That is 1 day, 1 week, several weeks, 1 month usually, or no more than 6 months. A project more than 6 months require a much more sophisticated planning and a more architectural type of strategic direction discussion. That is not recommended using the method we talk about in this case. And on this particular slide, there is actually one keywords I like to draw your attention to. This keyword is called independent. This independent, again, I cannot emphasize more. Each user story is a small program module. They have to be running and can be tested independently. So you can sort of like modularize the job, modularize the program, and modularize your planning as well. So everything leads to that concept of independent. And one last note on this particular slide is independent has a very close relationship to the concept we discuss in computer science or in programming course we call a transaction. So whenever you're dealing with a transaction, and the meaning of transaction become important to define a module, to define a job, and we want to manage the program by a clear, identifiable transaction. And to without further explanation, you probably remember from your programming class, we talked about how do you test a transaction. There's something called the ACID test, ACID test. For those of you who are interested, you might want to Google it and search for the ACID test to learn more about this concept of transaction, or the concept of independent, or the concept of modularization in software engineering. So mapping this methodology into, or the backlog, the product backlog, into a methodology we discussed earlier, using typically, again, this is a Scrum methodology or Agile methodology. In the Agile Sprint type of project planning, the assumption is again, you're going to be identify these user story and put them into the product backlog. And in each one of the sprint is defined as 1 weeks to 3 weeks usually, and every one of the small cycle or larger cycle or duplicate cycle, you perform certain task or try to consume the product backlog. And in the process of consumption, you prioritize the backlog. It's not like you have a list. Even though that we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 in terms of a number, sequence number in product backlog, every time you execute, you still need to prioritize the backlog. And the prioritization is actually one of the spirit in the Agile methodology. You always perform the most important job, most critical job in your Agile process. And when you go into next sprint cycle, and there might be additional story coming to your backlog, and the backlog need to be reprioritized again. So unlike the traditional sort of just-in-time management, because every inventory part is the same, the software Agile methodology, the backlog need to be prioritized every time you try to use it. And how do we prioritize all these backlog then? And your textbook has two terminology can help you to remember, or actually make sure that you understand the importance as a manager, project manager, to how to prioritize. The first one is the acronym called Moscow. I don't know how to pronounce that correctly, but anyway, Moscow, the of course capital of Russia, and is actually the acronym here stands for something. M stands for must perform, and S stands for should perform. C stands for could perform. So it is a prioritizing method. You look at something desired by the user story, and you're saying that, okay, something must be done first, and something should be done next, and something could be done, or maybe not. So that's how you think of a different level of importance in terms of the user story and the product backlog. And the other thing is think in terms of epic. Epic is designed something as an essential set of user story that you need to perform and complete. And the MVP stands for the minimal viable product, or minimal viable set of this epic or user story you need to perform. Both of them are telling you a very important concept. That is. In a lot of these desired feature, actually the functionality requirement, use the term requirements probably be more accurate. All these requirements you can collect from the user or coming from the stakeholder. Some of them are must-have. Some of them are, could have or desired. Must-have are something essential to your business operation. You have to do them. You have to complete them first. Something, nice to have. You can always leave them to the later. So in the Agile methodology, again, we always try to complete must-have in every sprint cycle and leave the nice to have or could have later in the future sprint cycle. On the other hand, some larger project, when we are encounter this hybrid release planning, then you have this different. Well, as you can probably see that the process is very similar. You plan in sprint cycle, but the way you prioritizing the backlog is different. The difference between this hybrid method and the previous agile method in terms of the backlog planning is that in hybrid approach, the backlog is dominant a lot by this front-end requirement or big front-end requirement you already set up. So the backlog does not change that much from one cycle to the other, but they are prioritized instead. So we are using some sort of well, it's not saying that you cannot add additional user story to the future sprint, but it's just that your big upfront requirement already prioritize the importance of the job for you. So you are some sort of constrained by this upfront planning process you have. So that is the major difference. Again, the difference between the hybrid and the agile is how you prioritizing the user story and requirements. In the typical Scrum methodology, if you have a chance to receive some of the Scrum training, you also learn that we're going to be using this flight plan to sort of communicate and manage your project with your project team. And you can probably notice this already. It looks pretty much like a Gantt chart. And as a matter of fact, it is sort of like a high-level Gantt chart. And you have the task to be performed on one hand in a reasonable hierarchical format. In this case, it's a data analytic project. You have to prepare the data first, which is called the ETL process, and then you have to perform analysis and summarizing function to calculate and to discover information from your data. And finally, you build chart and build model to explain or predict the future performance. It's sort of like there is a precedence relationship between these three jobs. So you present the job into, instead of using a calendar, use a sprint as a management tool. So it's a higher level project management tool. It's called the flight plan in the Scrum methodology. Put together the Gantt light chart and the project management and the sprint and phases management together. A typical management method, even in some of the tools that we have learned or examined in this course, such as IBM doors, that requirement management tool usually will give you some tabulate format of a project management plan, allow you to list the requirement in terms of user story, or simply just call them requirement, and the person who are responsible to the requirement, and their prioritizing rank. Some of them using color instead of using this so-called Moscow model, and in the real software environment. You can easily put together a project planning chart in managing this agile or hybrid methodology. In terms of the tool selection, of course, you can simply using a spreadsheet to do this type of management tool. That is typically what everybody is doing. Or you can purchase a more sophisticated team management tool. The benefit of team management tool, such as, again, the rational line of software from IBM or Visual Paradigm that you might have been exposed to, also link other environment such as your computer code. Each one of this requirement can be linked to your computer code, so you can manage those much easier in that environment. But again, simple tools such as spreadsheet or even Microsoft Word can proven to be very useful. The key is that you have, as a project manager, to have a very holistic view, and using tool like this, you can put a holistic view into a detailed job assignment and time management, time control sort of a tool for your project management use. So to summarize a little bit, it's very typically you have some sort of user story to start with, and you put them into different type of prioritization, and you sort of modularize them into epics, a set of must to be performed sort of a requirement, and you put them into the independent module of some kind and put them into a Gantt chart like format. Then you can manage the project. And the rest of is your how you manage your documentation, so you can read them more easily. Say, for example, you can use the indentation to represent different phases and cycle, or you can use the tabulate Gantt chart or so-called flight plan more to explain the precedence relationship, or how the project is playing out in the next 1 month or 6 months or so. So larger project can be easily managed using this agile methodology or hybrid methodology like planning method and tools. So the abstract lesson learned here is that the tabulate representation of management, such as Gantt chart and this flight plan, is also helpful. Is also derived from our continuous discussion on how do you analyze or present the analysis better. Tabulate format is actually a very useful, very helpful, not only in the conceptual management but also in time management as well. So that is all for this particular chapter. That's a review that we learned Gantt chart, modified Gantt chart, and we learned the detailed planning process using the Scrum methodology, Agile methodology, using your textbook's terminology. And the main difference is in backlog generations and prioritizing, and how do you manage the backlog. You create a different sort of a type of management style in the software engineering project. That's it. Talk to you in another lecture.